All right, y'all, let's wrap up this section that's dealing with federalism. And let me give you these last two powers that are on here. One of these is going to be the tax and spend power, and the other one is going to be privileges and immunities. And you'll notice up here, and I introduced this last time for exam purposes. Make sure that you're comfortable with what each of these powers are, but just as significantly, make sure that you're comfortable with the examples of these powers too. Now, the tax and spend power. This is another big one. And I think we've talked a little bit about how the idea of the government has the power to be able to tax and spend. And you'll notice as you take a look at this, they certainly will tax our paychecks. They take the taxes out oftentimes before we even get paid. They're getting a little bit wise with that. Of course, the other side of this is they've got the ability to spend. And what the federal government will do is that they will give us kind of sticks or carrots, if you will, to regulate our behaviors based upon their usage of the tax and spend power. Now, a really good example of this power and a case that deals with this is the drinking age. Now, I'm going to ask the question, and I do want you to think about this for just a second. What is the national drinking age in the United States? What is the national drinking age in the United States? The obvious answer is 21. Would you be shocked if I told you that there was no national drinking age at all? Why? Well, the federal government doesn't have the power to institute a national drinking age. Remember, it goes back to the idea that the federal government has got to have a power in the Constitution in order to be able to do things. Even if it's a good idea, the federal government, if it doesn't have a power, then doggone, they're not going to be able to get laws passed. So let me tell you what the federal government did a number of years ago. I'm going to go back to the dry erase board for just a second, the whiteboard, I guess. And I want you to think about this. Now, every year, y'all, the federal government provides the states with highway funds. Every year, the federal government provides the states with highway funds. And the basic idea is that each state is going to get money based upon the number of drivers that are there and based upon the amount of roads. So, Delaware might not have a lot of roads, but a lot of people drive through Delaware to get to DC or to get to Philly. So they have a hell of a lot of drivers. There are places like Texas that have a lot of drivers and they have a lot of roads. So they're going to get a lot of money. And then there are other smaller places that don't have a lot of money or don't have a lot of roads. Or maybe there are places like Montana that got a lot of roads, but not a lot of people. Well, using this combination, every year the federal government gives these states X amount of dollars based upon the amount of roads and the amount of drivers. The federal government wanting to deal with this drunk driving epidemic and, rewinding the clock a little bit, y'all. Used to be that the drinking age was 18. And right about the time that I was turning 18, the drinking age got bumped up to 21. I'm still maybe a little salty about that. But this is what the federal government did. They went to the states and they said, look, every year we give you these X amount of dollars. What we're going to do is if you will raise your drinking age to 21, not only are we going to give you X amount of dollars, but we're going to give you 5% more in free money. Now, if you're talking to elected officials, politicians, you're talking to government in general, anytime you can get free money, odds are you're going to do it because if there's one thing that you never have enough of, you never have enough of money. So a lot of states almost immediately jumped on this and said, yeah, let's do it. And the federal government is saying, we are going to tie the tax and spend power to being able to create this drinking age of 21. Well, South Dakota did not like this at all. South Dakota said, wait a minute. South Dakota said, the establishment of drinking ages has been a state power since the beginning of the country. This is not federal jurisdiction. You are stepping on state powers. South Dakota said, you know, we can't turn down this money. This is blackmail. You're forcing us to do your bidding by giving us this free money. And they're saying, this is not right. We have not invited you in. You do not have this power in the federal Constitution. Well, think about your own lives for just a second. Let's say that you've got a friend, right? And let's say that this friend comes up to you and says, hey, Jane, I get paid tomorrow. Can I borrow 20 bucks? I'll give it back to you tomorrow. I just need a little bit to get through tonight. And, boy, you'd really be doing me a solid. Now, you know that Jane smokes Newport Filter King cigarettes. And you look at Jane and you're like, okay, I'm going to loan you this money, but no cigarettes. And Jane's like, okay, I promise, no cigarettes. I just got to get some gas in the car, blah, blah, blah. So, you give Jane the 20 bucks, and 5 minutes later, you see her coming out of a convenience store, and Jane's got Slim Jims. Jane's got a Slurpee, big one. Jane's got cigarettes behind each ear, and she's already smoking and lit up a Newport Filter King. Would you ever loan Jane money again? Well, a lot of people would say no. Why? Because Jane broke the condition. Your condition was you can spend the money, I'll loan it to you, but you can't buy the cigarettes. Well, the federal government is kind of doing the same thing here. The federal government is saying, we are very willing to spend the money. We're very willing to not just give you what you normally get, but to give you even more. However, if you want the money, you've got to follow our condition. And if you don't want the money, then, don't agree to the condition, and you will still get what you ordinarily get, this X amount of dollars. Well, the case went before the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually ruled on the side of the government. And they said that, in fact, this was a reasonable exercise of the government's tax and spend power. What they said was that this was an incentive. They said that the extra 5% was an incentive, and the states were free to be able to, accept the money or not. And if they didn't accept it, they still got the actual money that, in fact, they were given at the beginning of all of this. They still were given that. Now, what the Supreme Court said was, if the federal government had done it differently and said, states, we will actually subtract 5%, now that would be blackmail. And, it's funny, you'll hear about people getting tax incentives. They get tax incentives if they get energy efficient appliances. There are tax incentives if, in fact, you get a solar powered, an electric car, these kinds of things. There are all sorts of incentives. In other words, the government is willing to give you more if you do certain things that the government wants you to do. But this case, South Dakota versus Dole, in this case, the Supreme Court basically said that government cannot be punitive. They cannot take away in order to get you to do things. And if government does do something like that, then at that point, guess what? That is unconstitutional. We've talked about our debt, at a couple of points already this semester. When you figure how much in the hole we are, maybe in fact we need to start rethinking this. But it's not policy that determines this, it's the law. And right now, the law says that they can only give incentives, but they can't force us to do things by kind of blackmailing us with tax purposes into doing it. Now, the last thing, y'all, that's actually in this section, and I'll go fairly quick with this one as well, is going to be the Privileges and Immunities Clause. This one is one that people don't hear very much about, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And the issue that I want to talk about with this one right quick is actually going to be unemployment. Now, I don't know if any of y'all have ever, lost a job, or maybe you know somebody that lost a job. It's a real traumatic kind of a thing. And, there's a something that you can gain if you do ever lose your job. This idea of unemployment. Unemployment benefits. Now, bear with me as I not only juggle my screens, but I juggle my seating position here. Unemployment works in an interesting sort of way in that it's designed to basically carry you over so that you don't starve or freeze in the winter, you don't live on the streets, this kind of a thing. But it's also trying to kind of push you somewhat gently into getting your next job. So think about this for just a second as I go back to the whiteboard, and I'm going to give you a couple of different states on this. One of them that I'm going to give you is going to be South Carolina. Okay. And the second one that I'm going to give you is actually going to be Connecticut. Now, y'all, there was a guy a number of years ago who had lost his job in the fine state of South Carolina. And this green little bar is going to be dealing with the benefits that he had gotten from the state. Well, you're going to get a certain amount of benefits, and it kind of depends on the state. Now, the other side of this, though, is that what the states do is they're going to give you a certain amount of benefits, but it's not really going to totally add up. And if I kind of draw this horizontal line approximately through here, you see that there's kind of a deficit that's actually in here, right? So you get a certain amount of money, but it's not enough to kind of deal with the cost of living. And since we're talking about the cost of living, well, the idea is that you're going to want to go out there and get your next job kind of quick so that you can eliminate this deficit. Well, this guy lost a job in South Carolina. And he went to the library and did some research. This was long before the days of the internet. And he realized that Connecticut was a state that actually had the highest unemployment benefits in the entire country. So if you draw that horizontal line over here now, well, it looks like this is not actually a deficit, but this actually looks like he may be able to pocket a little bit of cash. So what this guy did is he actually took his family and he moved them from South Carolina to Connecticut so that he could get the unemployment benefits on day one. Well, the Connecticut governor got a little pissed about all this. You're coming here to do what? We have the highest benefits in the country, and these benefits are supposed to be for our Connecticutans, the people that live in Connecticut. You've never worked here. You've never paid taxes. You've never contributed to the state. You should not be allowed to get benefits on day one. Okay, well, there's something to be said for that. And that actually makes pretty good sense. And this could be something that would be, bankrupting of the state. Maybe not bankrupting, but it would cost them. Now, the guy made kind of a pretty significant mistake. I guess, he was thinking that if I go to Connecticut, I will have South Carolina expenses, but Connecticut benefits, and I'm going to be able to turn a profit. But if you really look at this up here, no, there's still this deficit. In fact, he just maybe had bigger numbers. It was more expensive to live up in Connecticut. But his thought was, listen, I've got a valid unemployment claim. I'm eligible for South Carolina benefits. I should be able to go to Connecticut and get benefits there on day one. Think about your lives for just a second. If you could go to any college in the country when you get finished with OCCC, where would you go? Now, I know many of y'all might very well be interested in staying in state, but is there a reason why you don't go out of state? The money, right? If you don't have the money to be able to pay for out of state tuition, and see, this is kind of that argument here. If you live in Oklahoma, you can go to an Oklahoma State school because you've worked there. You've paid taxes there. You've contributed. You've volunteered. You've done things within the state to kind of earn some treatment, some benefit back from the state. But if you decide that you want to go to Kansas for some unknown reason, well, if you go to Kansas, you've never worked, you've never paid taxes, you've never volunteered, you've never contributed, you've never lived there. Well, they're going to charge you more so that technically they treat the Kansas residents who have done all of those things a little bit better. Well, if you don't get in-state tuition the first day you move somewhere, then maybe you shouldn't get unemployment benefits the first day that you go there either. Of course, that means that people might starve, people might freeze, because if he's moved his family all the way up to Connecticut, and then he's denied benefits, well, he's still unemployed. They don't have a lot of money. So this went before the Supreme Court. And let me go back to this outline for just a second, and then I'll give you a second take on this and we'll wrap this video up. But you'll notice down here, it's talking about this idea of unemployment and privileges and immunities. The privileges and immunities clause, y'all, has basically been interpreted as the idea that you have the right to petition government for the redress of grievances. You have the ability to use the navigable waterways. Maybe some of y'all go to lake, or maybe you do things on rivers, or maybe you even, will go out to the ocean. Well, where is it that that right comes from? At least for the lakes and the rivers, we're talking about privileges and immunities. And then the last thing that's kind of significant in all of this is this ability to travel. When you leave Oklahoma and go to a different state, whether you're driving, whether you're flying, whether you're hiking, the idea is that you get to go. It's not like you got to fill out a lot of paperwork. It's not like you got to get a new driver's license when you go to this other place. Why? Because of privileges and immunities. Y'all, the Supreme Court took a look at this case from this South Carolina man, and would you believe, even with the protests of the Connecticut governor, they said he won and should get unemployment benefits on his first day, day one in the state. Why? Because if they denied this right, then in fact, this would be denying the right to travel. Now, I got to be honest. I mean, I'm thinking that if you want to travel, you need to have the money to be able to pay for it. He was depending upon getting the money to travel from being in Connecticut. So, right there, that seems very, very problematic. Now, the other piece to this is I think the guy was running a scam. I think he's like, okay, I'm going to move my family where the benefits are higher. He just didn't think it all the way through. Well, let me give you a different example on this. And bear with me as I juggle my screens again. And I'm going to go back to the whiteboard. Now, in this instance, y'all, we went from a low cost of living, low benefit state to a high cost of living, high benefit state. What if, though, we actually did this in the other direction? Okay. Let's say that you're somebody that lives in Pennsylvania. And in fact, Pennsylvania has got, let me get my colors right on this, high cost of living, right? We've already talked about this. And this is cost of living. And let's say that they also have high benefits, but as you can see, these benefits do not equal the cost of living. Let's say that this person, instead of, as they move, they go to North Carolina. And North Carolina, y'all, is actually a state that's got lower cost of living. And North Carolina, y'all, has still got lower benefits. But as you look at this in this context, right? If I had lost a job in Pennsylvania and then went to North Carolina, I would actually turn a profit on this endeavor. Now, remember, the idea behind unemployment is they don't want you to starve, but they want to give you a push. They're not paying you as much in benefits as you need to live, so that this gives you an incentive to be able to go out and get another job. Well, if you take the benefits that you did pay for with your taxes, you did work in the state of Pennsylvania, and you took them down to a state where you had never worked, you're not screwing over North Carolina. You're just taking the benefits that you earned. But you are turning a profit. And that would seem to suggest that this might be a reason for you to not get a job as fast. Now, is this legal? Y'all, I don't know. But I'm going to tell you what, this is what I did years ago. I lost 3 jobs in 1 year in Pennsylvania, one of them being my Cracker Barrel job. And I said, you know what? I remembered this case dealing with South Carolina and Connecticut. And I said, to hell with this. I'm going back home. And I took my high Pennsylvania benefits and I turned a profit in North Carolina. Was it legal? I don't know. Did anybody find out? I don't know. Did I ever get in trouble? Abso-frickin-lutely not. Now, you might say, boy, what a scab you are, Semper. How shame on you. Well, this did turn into me getting back into education, which ultimately led to me teaching in college, which ultimately over a few decades has brought me to you. So, did I use unemployment benefits the proper way? Well, in terms of turning it into a career, yes. At the time, oh God, I was grilling chicken and I was drinking Corona back before it was a virus. And I probably did take advantage of the system a little bit. But with that being said, it is funny when you don't have money issues to be concerned about, you can really focus on getting your life right. And that's exactly what I did. Y'all, let me stress to you the most important thing for the government is that it's got to have a power in order to be able to do things. Whether you're talking about full faith and credit clause, which we talked about previous, interstate commerce, tax and spend power, or now privileges and immunities, these are 4 places where the federal government and to a lesser extent the state governments have some powers and responsibilities laid out for them. If the federal government doesn't have a power that it can use, then the federal government cannot act. That gives the states significantly more authority in the absence of federal power. I'll stop there. Thank y'all.